Interesting week for this talk. Should we demand that our politicians embody high ethical standards in their personal life and in their professional life? Do values belong at the center of our governance? In other words, does character matter in politics? Now, I'm going to start, as I often do, with a philosophical and historical overview. Certainly, a lot of the great philosophical thinkers thought the answer to that question was yes. Plato urged voters to choose rulers according to their character. He said, vote for people who just demonstrate temperance, self-control, self-discipline, dependability, and honesty. I'm not making it up. Those were the 5 words Plato used. Okay? Only such people, Plato said, could rule as philosopher kings. Disinterested stewards protecting the common good. That was the focus. New York Times writer Greg Wiener emphasized that from Aristotle to Aquinas to Edmund Burke, philosophers have praised rulers who display, quote, a deep capacity for judgment that enables one to choose the most appropriate means towards worthy ends. Now, I think this capacity requires an even-handed and balanced perspective on the world, a perspective that's unaffected by personal desires and social biases. Enlightenment philosophers embraced the virtue of democratic leaders who not only put aside their personal interests, but were also wise and enlightened. And in a representative democracy, they told us that politicians earn our respect and our vote not simply by doing as we ask, because we ask them, in fact, to demonstrate that they are wiser and more experienced than us. That's the reason why we have a representative democracy, whether you like that or not. That's the theory. After all, you don't choose a surgeon who's going to just do what you say for every cut and stitch. You want a surgeon who's going to do a good job for you because he knows better. He knows surgery better than you do. Edmund Burke counseled, your representative owes you not his industry only, but his judgment. He betrays instead of serving you if he sacrifices it to your opinion. So your representative betrays you if he sacrifices what you want to do for his opinion, because you've chosen him to be a wise ruler. And that's why the founders of this nation, at least, are so honored in our history and in our sculptures and in our paintings. People like Franklin and Jefferson tried to be those sorts of representatives, and they counseled us to elect virtuous people. James Madison, one of the key writers of the Constitution, had great faith in legislators, particularly senators, he said. That's why they were given 6-year terms, because they were buffered from the people, supposedly. They were originally chosen by state legislatures. But he called senators and legislators that you should vote for, quote, temperate and respectable. In Federalist 10, he reflects Edmund Burke's faith in leaders that would do what they thought best, when Madison wrote that their constituents should choose people who would not just reflect their views, but, quote, refine and enlarge their views. They should help educate and shape their constituents. And in this model, our representatives have to be paragons of virtue, because they're actually trying to bring out our best. And throughout history, one characteristic often ascribed to those we judge as great political leaders are that they cared more about principle than politics. In the midst of the ebb and flow of popular opinion, great leaders stand firm in their conviction, something that, whether you like them or not, Winston Churchill and Abraham Lincoln are said to have done. They remain consistent, firmly rooted in their values despite the sways of public opinion, despite the fact that they got very unpopular at times. Abraham Lincoln actually reflects this sort of view when he said, reputation is the shadow, character is the tree. So shadows shift, their angle, they come and go, but the tree stays. That, at least, is the story that many of us like to talk about democracy. Like, over the last few decades, it's a little harder to see this being truly reflective of our democracy. popular consensus is hard to really get that sense from. When today's voters are asked in the abstract if character counts in politics, there's not really a clear answer. A study from the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture said that 90% of respondents said that good character is essential to a successful democracy. That's a good thing. 90% said that. But 50% said that a politician can be effective even if he has little personal character. So there's an uncertainty here. It gets even muddier when you ask people about a particular politician. You find that the answers depend on the politician in question and the political affiliation of the person giving the answer. Because people excuse politicians who share their political perspective. We tend to forgive our own. The character of any given politician means less to us than what team they play for. I mean, Democrats tend to forgive the sexual misbehavior of their iconic heroes like FDR or John Kennedy. Our current president's been given a pass by conservatives. I mean, many of the evangelicals who wrap themselves in the Bible and condemn the personal behavior of certain liberal politicians they don't like rarely mention the personal failings of the current president. And I wonder if those who bet on Trump as a winner simply decided to ignore the numerous shady financial dealings, the fact that he stiffs his creditors and banks and business partners, his marital infidelity, his 3 divorces, his penchant for lying. Did they simply excuse that because he was going to be their winner? In the 1990s, Bill Clinton was pilloried by conservatives for his philandering and sexual misconduct. One Republican convention speaker drew loud cheers when he said, "You cannot be one kind of man and another kind of president." Is that true? Republicans argue that anyone who couldn't govern himself shouldn't be allowed to govern others. Interesting. Bill Bennett, a conservative writer, he wrote the Book of Virtues.
Yeah.
It's an interesting book, actually. But he said, referring to Clinton, "It is our character that supports the promise of our future, far more than any particular government programs or policies." Now, that's interesting. That it's more important what character you are than what your policies are. He sharpened his critique of Clinton, saying that Clinton failed to live up to presidential standards. He wrote, "The president is the symbol of the people of the United States. He is the person who stands for us in the eyes of the world and the eyes of our children." And again, I can't help but take a deep sigh when I think of this week and wonder what sort of language kids are going to use on the playground next week when they see children of other colors. Now, it's a tactic often used to bring up children to sort of test the moral fiber of any individual, because the innocence of youth is something that we care a great deal about, and we want to have our role models protect them, not be their attackers. And that's why when credible accusations about Roy Moore came up, about the fact that when he was an adult, he propositioned minors, girls, when he was 30, 35 years old, I thought the whole Alabama Senate race was over. Because I didn't think that evangelical moralists who wrap themselves in the Bible will go out and vote for a man who, as an adult, was trying to seduce young girls. Now, maybe it wasn't true, but it sure seems like there was a lot of evidence. I didn't think they'd actually vote for that, but they did. I wasn't that surprised that the extreme right voted for him. I wasn't even surprised that some of them gave some bizarre excuse saying that the Virgin Mary was a teenager when she birthed Christ. That was the weirdest thing I heard. But it did disappoint me that certain Republican mainstream people at first distanced themselves from Moore, but after the initial wave, they supported him again. I mean, presidential advisor Kellyanne Conway endorsed Moore, saying the Republicans had to protect their majority in the Senate. And this seemed like a purely Machiavellian calculation, preferring political practicalities to morality. And Trump doubled down on it. He came out the next day saying, we need his vote for stopping crime, illegal immigration, border wall, military, pro-life, VA, judges, Second Amendment, and more, end quote. And I have to add that this bizarre political justification doesn't even make me think that that was necessary for Trump, because given the similarity of the grotesque, misogynist, and bigoted comments that both he and Moore gave, they could have been friends had politics not been involved. But their politics overlapped. Now, I'm going to make a side point to note the obvious, and that is that up to this point, all of the examples I've given about bad behavior have been men. And many of them, the bad behavior has been about their mixture of power, politics, and sex. And I can't go into detail today, so I have a whole other platform next month that I'm going to dedicate to the Me Too campaign, trying to figure out how as a man I can speak in a way that is respectful without appropriating voices. But it's certainly about men behaving badly. So as I move into the rest of this discussion today, I just have to ask how much of this is wrapped into that issue of powerful, privileged men without sexual self-control. More next month. Let me turn now to this concept of principle and politics and how you weigh the two. This article by Greg Greener in the New York Times wrote of an increasingly common trend that he sees in politics, where people tend to ignore significant character flaws in exchange for political advantage. The title of his article is The Scoundrel Theory in American Politics. And he suggests there that more and more politicians succeed despite a lack of ethics. They become party hacks, simply currying favor by supporting this or that policy initiative or legislative bill of importance to political contributors. Wiener calls this creature a, quote, politician as disembodied policy array. In other words, a candidate whose character is irrelevant because they're simply a vessel for policy preferences. So I wonder if that's what our politics has come for. Just a quid pro quo. I'll vote for this if you support me. It doesn't matter anything else about the character. Before we do conclude that that's the state of politics, I did think a little bit about how, if we're honest with ourselves, many of us put aside our ethical concerns when it serves our interests. I mean, I want to save the planet, but I burn a hell of a lot of fossil fuels. I did this morning. Sure, I bought a a Prius, 50 miles per gallon, but we all tend to not always live up to our ethical commitments when it serves our self-interest. I know that. And when we choose experts, we don't always choose experts because of their ethics. When we want a plumber, we want somebody to fix our sink. And like when we want a surgeon, we pick somebody who's a good surgeon. I mean, in the best of all possible world, I wouldn't have to choose between a jerk who's a good surgeon or a really nice guy who is like a mediocre surgeon. But if I had to choose, I'd pick the jerk. Right? So we all do that. We do tend to put our ethics to the side at times when it serves us. So I wonder whether we do that in the same way ourselves with politicians, whether we are more tribal than we'd like to admit we are. In business, we certainly do that. We often reward people who make profits. I mean, look at the CEO of Amazon, Jeff Bezos. $95 billion in personal assets. He is praised as a model businessman because he has built this empire. But there are lots of reports about how the workplace at Amazon is extremely stressful, it's competitive, it's demeaning to employees, let alone the fact that he's driving many businesses out of business and burning fossil fuels with every delivery. But this is not unusual. I mean, we like to point to, or I like to point to, Chobani Yogurt, an incredible CEO who gives benefits to their workers and shares of it and lots of charity work. But those are the exception. Cutthroat tactics still dominate in business. So, in government, in our own lives, in business, maybe that's just the way it is. Maybe we should give up these utopian ideas that all of our heroes, all of the people we root for, all of our team are ethical people. A couple of years ago, I spoke for Martin Luther King Day about the man who was my hero growing up, as he was for many of you. And I remember about 25 years ago, I read a book by Reverend Abernathy and got into the news talking about King's marital infidelity and his plagiarism, supposedly. And this really hurt. This was the man who taught me the meaning of the content of character growing up. So how was I going to play those elements into my hero? Is it legitimate that I still praise him for being remarkable in standing up for social justice, or do I have to somehow take him off the pedestal that I put him on? Am I only covering up what I don't want to see? Am I doing what conservatives did when they held their nose and they voted for Roy Moore? I'm repulsed by that comparison. It doesn't sit well with me. Of course, Moore was dealing with children, etc. Abernathy, in his book, which was titled "And the Walls Come Tumbling Down," tried to contextualize King's failings, saying, Jesus was a nonviolent personality, but Jesus became violent on one occasion when he ran people out of the temple because they were misusing his house. Martin Luther King shoved a woman across the bed the next day because he lost his temper. People are just people. Human beings are mortal, feeble beings, and the Apostle Paul had a thorn in his flesh of which he spoke about. My friend Martin Luther King Jr. would have wanted me to tell it like it is and be honest and truthful. I don't know if King would have wanted that or not. We'll never know. But many defenders of King's legacy were angry at Abernathy. And maybe it's because, certainly for black Americans, there was such a great need for an untarnished hero. Part of what I did in my thinking about this was that I put it into the context of a country that knew that character counted, because when it came to King, they were involved in character assassination. Numerous historical studies show that the government tried to discredit King, that J. Edgar Hoover's FBI harassed and spied on King, they tapped his phones, they bugged his offices, they explored his private life, they produced a steady stream of critical appraisals calling him the most dangerous black man in America. They called him a liar, a communist, a moral degenerate. They sent him threatening letters. And these were the actions of the people that were supposed to be defending his life against assassination. But they were involved in character assassination because they knew character counted. Now, King was not a saint. He was a human being. In fact, when I talked about this issue a number of years ago, I said the lesson I took was not that he was a saint, but that he was a human being. And that meant that I could try to live like him. Because I am not a saint. None of us are saints. He was able to do one thing that I think is at the center of what character is about. He did not sell his ideals for a few more years of life. He did not give up his virtue, his principles that he stood for, that he spoke about, for a more comfortable lifestyle. He was not perfect. But he remained continually committed to the integrity of every person. And he saw a system dripping of abuse, and he said no more. He found a truth that made his life so whole that he was willing to die for it. And he did. He spoke of a truth to power, and he emphasized a demanding love which saw all human beings as of infinite worth. So is my need for this call to justice so strong that I accept Martin Luther King's personal failings? I don't answer all the questions today. I want to spend some time talking about this private-public division. Felix Adler, who founded the ethical culture movement, talked a great deal about this in his 1923 book, The Reconstruction of the Spiritual Ideal. He wrote about 3 deep spiritual pains, but I want to focus on one, and that was the pain of a divided conscience, of a psyche torn in two, divided between a moral perspective focusing on the public and a private life. It might be that we are a well-respected, admirable person in public, but a scoundrel impersonally. Or it may be that we are a good parent and husband and friend, but professionally we constantly violate basic ethical principles. Either way, it's sort of a Jekyll and Hyde thing. And Adler was particularly interested on how those who are kind and generous in person can end up operating professionally as ruthless landlords or industrial barons. He was convinced that the mechanism of the modern marketplace, with its emphasis on competition and monopolization, created these Jekyll and Hyde characters. Now, he puts forward an interesting claim. He said that living with such divided conscience is very unpleasant. That acting publicly in ways contrary to our private conscience is painful. According to him, one of our most fundamental needs is, quote, for relief from the intolerable strain of a divided conscience. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Human nature in revolt against itself cannot rest. Adler continued, the intolerable strain of the divided conscience is felt by men who are eagerly desirous to make their life whole, of all of a piece, of achieving consistency in their conduct throughout, who do not see how to do it because they find the ethical standard which they acknowledge in their private relations, in which they would like to expand so as to cover their business and professional relations. Their conduct as citizens is incapable of such expansion. So if we think we are good in our private life, it's often hard to live that well publicly. And I thought of this when I read a column by David Brooks. He wrote of a division between what he called eulogy virtues and resume virtues. Eulogy virtues are the virtues that you once said at your funeral. And resume virtues are the virtues you need to get ahead. On the one hand, we're encouraged to demonstrate social strength, to drive, to succeed, to be the best in our profession, to rise to the top civically. Those are resume virtues. But we want to be good people. Eulogy virtues. And it's hard to get both in the same life. It's hard to be compassionate and honest and generous, while also demonstrating leadership and self-sufficiency and excellence in one's field. Although it's hard, we have to try. I think that we have to try to gain this wholeness, a consistency. I know that different personal qualities are needed to get ahead than are to be a generous and ethical person. I know that. But the two worlds shouldn't be completely separated. Wiener writes in the Times, public virtue exists, and it is inseparable from the character of the person who exercises it. The hollowing out of the personal role of the statesman withers political life. It denies the human parts of politics that connect us to one another. I think that's fundamental. I don't want hollow, divided politicians running my country. While no one is perfect, I want women and men who, while maintaining an appropriate division between their public and private lives, strive for goodness in both of those realms. I want my leaders to apply ethics and wisdom at the world at large, but also to apply ethics and wisdom when they look inside themselves. This well-roundedness and this wholeness, I think, is essential to character. It's about integrity. There are two definitions of integrity in the dictionary. The first one most of you probably know, and that is the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles. That's certainly something that I think is important that our politicians have. I want them to be honest with themselves, I want them to be honest with other people, and try to live a life guided by principle. But the second definition is particularly important to me. It is, quote, the state of being whole and undivided. When I think of politicians that have a closet full of secrets, with a shiny public persona, but in fact underneath they're deceitful and they're indiscreet, I find it hard to believe that they can really operate effectively as public stewards of the common good. If they constantly have to maintain this facade of moral righteousness, I think it would distract them, sap their energy, and hurt their work. So this unity, this wholeness, I think is fundamental to character, and all of us work on it. I want to conclude by turning to somebody who I thought demonstrated this wholeness. I want to turn to somebody who I think focused on this division between the public and the private, between the self and the other. This division between self and other is something I've talked about a lot here. I do believe that I'm an autonomous individual, separate from all of you. I think all of you are the same. But I am also my relationships. I am a leader of this ethical society. You are a member. That's a part of who you are. You are family members. We're parents. We're brothers. We're siblings. All of that make up who we are. So this combination of being both ourselves and related to others around us is fundamental. This desire for wholeness and this desire to serve the public good was something handed down to me through my family for generations. I want to point out my grandfather, Robert A. Taft, who in a 1938 Christmas radio address deplored the separation, this division between ourselves and other people. His words sound pretty important for today. He says, "It has become fashionable in the world today to take a bitter and uncompromising position in favor of one's own interests, no matter how it affects the interests and activities of others. We see nationalism develop to a point that threatens in a few years a war to destroy civilization built by centuries of effort. In this country, every group insists on setting up one or more formal organizations and choosing leaders whose only concern is forwarding the group's interests." We see this everywhere. Taft continues, "Of course, fundamentally, this bitterness is due to a deeper cause, to the general unwillingness to recognize the good faith, honesty, and point of view of others. It's the duty of all of us to urge every group, and particularly our group and our leaders, the absolute necessity for tolerance of the views of others and a willingness to recognize the fact that our own interests must always be subordinated to the public welfare. Putting it another way, we cannot improve our own condition at the expense of the welfare of other groups." End quote. Bringing out the best in others brings out the best in ourselves. The founders of our nation did not anticipate the Tea Party. A couple of years ago when the Tea Party was born, they took aim at the common good. They said it wasn't a worthy goal. They became crystallized as an angry and destructive force in the electorate. The Wall Street journalist Peggy Noonan wrote an article entitled, "What Advice Would Robert Taft Have for the Tea Party and the GOP Establishment?" To summarize, Noonan said that Taft would have said that the political antagonists have to compromise for the common good. The founders of our nation appreciated the importance of considering the common good. The Federalist Papers said that the aim of every political constitution is or ought to be first to obtain for rulers people who possess the most wisdom to discern and the most virtue to pursue the common good for the good of society. Human personality, history is complex. So it makes it difficult to answer the question of, does character count in politics? Of course it does. But in all honesty, we all struggle to live a life of integrity and wholeness, which is why we hold on to our heroes so strongly, I think. It's why we occasionally overlook their inconsistencies in their ethical lives. It's why we forgive those who align with us politically. But our country is torn in two. And we could learn from my grandfather. Noonan said that Taft contained peacefully within himself two cultural strains that are now seemingly at war. And she concludes that Taft, known for decades as Mr. Republican, would have hearkened back to the first great Republican, Abraham Lincoln, who set up political opponents. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. It is the ability to stay in relationship with others while being humble and hardworking that's a great part of character. And that character, I think, is necessary for our nation to remain whole. Thank you very much.